All right, so let's jump into this deep dive on the Gaza crisis. You sent over a whole bunch of news articles and even a YouTube video,
Yeah.
all dealing with the humanitarian situation there,
Yeah.
especially with winter. Yeah, coming up soon.
Yeah. It's a really complicated situation.
For sure.
There's so many factors, all kind of intertwined. But I think what really jumps out from all these sources is just the sheer scale of this crisis.
Right.
The devastation and displacement are really unprecedented.
Yeah, and it's striking just how many people. One article I was reading said that 90% of the population has been displaced.
Wow.
Imagine that, like, almost everyone
Almost everyone.
forced from their homes.
Yeah.
They're living in these temporary camps, struggling to get basic necessities.
Mm-hmm.
Food.
Food, water, medicine.
Yeah, it's a recipe for a public health catastrophe,
Absolutely.
especially with the colder weather coming in.
Yeah.
The articles from the UN and different aid organizations are really sounding the alarm about that.
Yeah. It's not even just the physical needs either.
Right.
It's the psychological impact, the constant fear, the uncertainty. That's particularly hard on children.
Yeah, I remember there was this one image in one of the articles that really stuck with me.
Yeah.
It was this mother, she was using just scraps of wood to make a fire,
Oh, wow.
just trying to keep her kids warm
Oh, gosh.
while she's like cooking some zucchini.
Oh, man.
It hits you in the gut when you see something like that.
Absolutely. And I think what's also interesting is how these sources highlight the actions of both Israel and Hamas,
Right.
each with their own justifications for, what's happening.
It's not just a one-sided story.
Exactly.
Let's
There's two sides to it.
yeah, let's start with Israel's side.
Okay.
What have they been doing? They've been conducting these daily airstrikes.
Yeah.
They launched a ground invasion,
Mm-hmm.
and they're controlling the flow of all the aid that's going into Gaza.
Yeah. And their stated reasons for these actions
Now,
are,
why are they doing all this?
well, they say to target Hamas militants
Okay.
and to respond to that initial Hamas attack
Hmm.
back in October 2023.
Right.
They argue that Hamas is using civilians as shields
Mm.
and that they are doing everything they can to minimize any harm to non-combatants.
Okay, so that's what Israel's saying, but then
Yeah.
you have all these groups
Yeah.
like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. They're accusing Israel of collective punishment.
Mhm.
They're even going so far as to say that these actions are tantamount to genocide,
Wow.
especially when it comes to, like, restricting access to water.
Yeah, that's a very serious charge.
Yeah, it is.
It's worth noting that Israel completely denies this.
Right.
They're claiming that they have facilitated water deliveries
Okay.
and they're maintaining desalination plants.
Right.
But Human Rights Watch is countering that
Yeah.
by pointing to all this destroyed infrastructure,
Right.
like wastewater treatment facilities
Right.
and the power sources for those facilities.
Oh, wow.
They even cite a key reservoir that's been damaged.
So it's just this back and forth
Yeah.
of narrative.
Yeah, clash of
And
narratives.
it makes it so difficult to understand what's really going on there. It's
Yeah.
not just about what's actually happening, it's
Mhm.
how each side is portraying it.
Exactly. And then on top of that, you have the international community trying to navigate this
Right.
incredibly complex landscape.
What are they doing?
The UN is pushing for a ceasefire,
Okay.
but there are so many obstacles.
Like
The issue of Israeli hostages being held by Hamas
right.
and Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails.
Right. So the potential terms of this ceasefire seem to revolve around these prisoners,
Yeah.
but the mistrust is so deep
Deep.
that negotiations keep breaking down.
Totally.
And meanwhile, the people in Gaza are caught in the middle of all of this,
Exact.
and with winter coming.
That's the really frightening part.
Yeah, I mean,
Those flimsy tents they're living in offer very little protection from the cold and the rain.
no, they don't.
One article I read quotes a mother saying,
What'd she say?
"I'm scared of waking up one day to find one of the children frozen to death."
Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
So it's just
it's terrifying.
really scary.
Yeah, and the UN is predicting a surge in all sorts of problems.
Mm.
Respiratory illnesses, hypothermia,
Mm-hmm.
malnutrition. All this is just going to get worse as winter comes.
Absolutely. And this brings us to a deeper question.
Okay.
This genocide accusation,
Mm,
it's being thrown around by both sides.
yeah.
You have Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch
Yeah.
saying that Israel's actions need to be investigated,
Right.
while Israel accuses Hamas of genocide for their initial attack,
Hmm.
the one that killed over 1,200 people in Israel, mostly civilians.
So how do we even make sense of that?
Yeah.
What exactly constitutes genocide under international law?
Right.
And are either of these situations actually meeting that definition?
That's the big question.
It's heavy stuff.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a weighty term, genocide, that's for sure.
It is. And it's not just about like the number of casualties.
Right.
It's also the intent behind the actions
Okay.
to meet the legal definition of genocide. There has to be proof of a deliberate attempt to destroy a specific group of people
Okay.
in whole or in part.
So just like causing a lot of suffering,
Right.
that's not enough.
Exactly.
There has to be this plan, like this systematic effort
Yes.
to actually wipe out a specific population.
Exactly. And that's what makes these accusations against both Israel and Hamas so complex.
Yeah.
Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, they're focusing on the water issue in Gaza.
Right.
They're saying that by destroying infrastructure, by controlling access to water sources, Israel is intentionally creating conditions that could lead to the destruction of the Palestinian population.
But Israel says they're providing water.
Right.
They've built desalination plants.
Yeah.
They're saying that their actions are about self-defense, about targeting Hamas.
Yeah.
It's not about wiping out Palestinians. And then on the flip side,
Yeah.
you have Israel saying that the Hamas attack back in October,
Right.
where they killed over 1,200 people in Israel,
Right.
mostly civilians,
Yeah.
they're saying there was an act of genocide.
They're saying that was genocide.
They're arguing that Hamas was specifically targeting civilians with the intent to kill as many Israelis as possible.
Right. So both sides are using this incredibly charged term.
It's a loaded word,
Yeah.
but the context is so different.
Very different.
One is about like the consequences
Yeah.
of this military campaign.
Right.
The other is about like a direct attack on civilians.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if it's even helpful to use this word, genocide, in these situations.
Yeah. Does it muddy the waters?
Yeah.
That's a really valid question.
Yeah.
It's such a powerful word, genocide, with so much historical baggage
Absolute.
that using it carelessly can almost trivialize its true meaning.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, if they believe there's evidence of genocidal intent, they have a responsibility to call it out.
Yeah, it definitely makes it harder for people like us,
Yeah.
just trying to understand what's going on.
Trying to figure out what's happening.
Separate fact from rhetoric.
Yeah.
And then you add in this humanitarian crisis,
Right.
all this suffering
Absolutely.
of the people in Gaza.
That's the immediate concern, no matter what labels are being used.
Yeah.
These sources paint a pretty grim picture.
Yeah.
Winter is coming, and those makeshift shelters offer absolutely no protection from the cold.
No.
The articles are talking about people burning anything they can find
Oh, wow.
just to stay warm.
And the water shortage,
Yeah,
it's only going to get worse.
absolutely.
Even if there's disagreement about Israel's intent,
Right.
the fact remains that people don't have enough clean water
Yeah,
for drinking, cooking, even basic hygiene.
right. And that creates a breeding ground for disease.
Yeah.
The UN is warning about a potential surge in respiratory illnesses,
Oh, wow.
hypothermia, and a worsening of existing problems like malnutrition.
Right.
It's a situation that could very quickly spiral out of control.
And yet it just feels like this stalemate.
Yeah,
The ceasefire negotiations keep stalling.
right.
The accusations are just flying back and forth.
Yeah.
And the people in Gaza are just bearing the brunt of all of it.
Which brings us to the role of the international community.
Yeah, what are they doing?
We see condemnations, calls for restraint.
Mm-hmm.
But is that enough?
Right.
What can the UN actually do
Yeah.
to enforce a ceasefire or to ensure that humanitarian aid is getting through?
I mean, the UN General Assembly passed resolutions
Right.
demanding a ceasefire and support for UNRWA,
Yeah.
the agency that aids Palestinian refugees. But Israel opposed them.
Yeah.
And these resolutions, they're not even legally binding.
Right. So what other options are there? Some are talking about sanctions against Israel, but that could escalate things further. Others are pushing for a more forceful diplomatic effort.
Like what?
Maybe bringing in other countries to mediate?
It just feels like everyone is so dug in
Totally.
to their own positions.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine any kind of compromise right now.
It is. And that ITV news analysis you sent over
Yeah.
even suggested that Hamas might be intentionally provoking Israel,
Really?
hoping for a full-scale invasion.
Wow, that's a chilling thought.
It is.
If that's true, it suggests they're willing to sacrifice their own people
Yeah.
for some kind of strategic advantage.
Yeah. We have to be careful about attributing motives, though.
Right.
It's a complex situation, and we're dealing with a lot of speculation here.
It's definitely a reminder to be critical
Yes,
of everything we read and everything we hear.
exactly.
We need to be aware of all the biases,
Absolutely.
the agendas that are at play, and try to find the truth somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we move towards the end of this deep dive, I think it's important to step back and consider the broader implications.
Okay.
What does this conflict say about the state of the Middle East?
Mm-hmm.
About the role of the international community?
Yeah.
About the future of the peace process?
Right.
If there even is one.
Those are big questions.
They are.
But I think they're the right ones to be asking.
I agree.
This isn't just about Gaza.
No.
It's about this much larger web of political and historical forces that have been at play for decades.
Decades. And as individuals trying to make sense of it all, it's easy to feel overwhelmed,
Yeah.
even powerless. But I think that's where we need to shift the focus.
Okay.
What can we as individuals actually do to make a difference in this situation?
Yeah, it feels like a lot of responsibility, honestly. Like, just knowing about this stuff isn't enough.
Yeah.
What can we actually do from so far away?
It's a question a lot of people wrestle with when confronted with these kinds of global crises.
Yeah.
It's easy to feel paralyzed by the scale of it all.
Especially with all this conflicting information and all these different narratives. It's hard to know what to believe, who to support.
Yeah, that's where critical thinking comes in.
Okay.
We can't just passively consume this information. We have to actively engage with it.
Right.
Look at the sources, consider the biases, weigh the evidence.
So like you said before, be informed,
Yes.
not just overwhelmed.
Yes.
But then what's the next step?
Well, for some people, it might be about raising awareness.
Okay.
Talk to friends and family, share information online, contact their elected officials.
So making sure this issue stays on people's radar.
Exactly.
Because it's easy for these things to fade from the headlines.
It is.
Especially when there's so many other crises happening around the world.
Right. It's about keeping the pressure on for a resolution.
Mm-hmm.
For others, it might be about supporting humanitarian efforts.
Okay.
Donating to organizations that are providing aid to the people in Gaza, volunteering time or resources.
Yeah, there are so many organizations that are working on the ground there. Doctors Without Borders, the UN Relief and Works Agency, all sorts of groups trying to meet those basic needs.
Yes, and I imagine even a small donation can make a real difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Every little bit helps.
And for some, it might be about advocating for political solutions.
Okay.
Supporting groups that are working toward a peaceful resolution, pushing for diplomacy and dialogue.
Because right now, it just seems like the biggest missing piece is that everyone is talking at each other, not with each other.
Exactly. And until that changes, it's hard to see how this conflict ends.
Yeah.
It requires a willingness to compromise,
Right.
to see the other side's humanity, and that's a tall order given the history and the current level of mistrust.
It makes you wonder, are there any historical examples that we can look to for guidance?
Yeah.
Conflicts that seemed like they were intractable, but eventually found a path to peace.
There are certainly precedents,
Okay.
though each situation is unique, of course.
Right.
The key seems to be a combination of factors.
Like what?
Strong international pressure,
Okay.
internal shifts within the conflicting parties, and often a willingness to engage in dialogue even when it seems impossible.
It's a long road for sure.
It is a long road.
But this deep dive has made one thing very clear to me.
What's that?
We can't afford to be passive observers.
I agree, whether it's through education advocacy or support, we all have a role to play in pushing for a just and lasting solution to this crisis. And that starts with acknowledging the complexities, wrestling with the difficult questions, and refusing to accept the status quo.
Well said. This has been a challenging deep dive,
It has.
but also an incredibly valuable one.
I agree.
It's given me a much deeper understanding of the situation in Gaza, the historical context, and all the different perspectives at play.
Excellent.
And hopefully it's equipped you with the knowledge and the motivation to continue engaging with this issue in a meaningful way.
I hope so.
I know I will. Thanks for guiding us through this. It's been a real eye-opener.
You're very welcome.
And for you listening, I hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought. It's a complex situation, but it's one that deserves our attention and our action. Thanks for joining us.